this would just have to be made similar to the.
All right, so we'll go through that, and if you still have the question, feel free to ask. Okay, sure. Yeah. Okay, so let me just share the screen. There we go. So we were talking about shadchanos yesterday and what the halachic obligation. It basically boils down to whatever the convention of your community is really the. And then we talked about what if someone starts the process and another person is the closer. So usually you give the starter a third and the closer 2/3. That's the way that the halacha views it. Now, shadchan o mitavech shehitasek v'torach v'lo hitzliach lahavi lidei gemar ein lo schar klal. A person who's a shadchan, or a person who's a broker, or is a headhunter, and is trying to find you a house, or a shidduch, or a job, and they are unsuccessful, they are entitled to 0. That's the law. That's the halacha. Unless, of course, there was an agreement that was made in advance that you're going to pay in advance whether or not the person is successful. Of course, you can negotiate whatever you want to in advance, right? My son, who's a single young man, very, very successful and good looking and all that stuff, but he still hasn't gotten married yet. So he decided there's this young lady in a completely different city who does shidduchim professionally, and she said, "Give me $2,500 up front, and I'll work for you, and I'll find you a girl." And so he paid her $2,500 up front, but nothing's hit yet. So we'll let you know what happens. But anyway, so that's not the normal kind of arrangement. No, the normal arrangement is you pay only upon success. And it's the same thing with a broker also. Brokers do this, real estate brokers are the same way. They don't get their commission unless they make the sale. Okay. Now, Mishpat el hashiduch la'achar hatznaim, mikol makom tzarich l'shalim l'shadchan. What happens if there's an engagement, mazel tov? They do the tanaim, okay, but then they break the engagement. Now again, this is where they do the tanaim. So nonetheless, you still have to pay the shadchan. If there's an engagement and it gets broken, and there's no tanaim, then you don't have to pay the shadchan, because that's as if it just never went through. But that's also only when the minhag is to pay after the tanaim. Some places have a minhag to pay after the wedding. And if the wedding never happened, so then you don't have to pay for the shadchanas. What happens if the wedding went through and then the marriage ends immediately afterwards because of some defect that was discovered after the fact? So then that's what we call a mekachtos, and it's even a shaila whether there even has to be a get, because it could be that you can just annul the marriage because of one of the two parties or both parties were working under false assumptions when they got married. So then the shadchan, even if he got paid, would have to return the money. Okay. Ach shel hachasan o hakala shayu me'uravim b'inyan hashidduch lo magia lahem demei shadchanas. Family members are not entitled to shadchanas. So the brother was involved in his sister's shidduch. He can't now claim to his parents, "Pay me or to his sisters-in-laws pay him. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Next, Rashai Hashadchen Lios Eid B'Tanoim O Eid Kiddushin Gam B'Makom Shenogim L'Shalim Rak Achar HaNisuin. Another interesting halacha. Kept the Shadchan be one of the Eidim. After all, he has a financial interest in this marriage, so he's a prejudiced party. And we know that in order to be a kosher aid, you can't have any stakes in the transaction that's taking place. Like, for example, if I'm a party to a transaction, I can't be one of the witnesses. So the shadchan, in a sense, is a party to the transaction, but nonetheless, we paskin that he's not a substantive party to the transaction of the kiddushin, and so therefore he's allowed to be a witness, which is an interesting shaila. I'm sure it comes up more often than we think, right? How often, the rabbi. Yeah, but he doesn't have to be. That's the point. Okay. Chasen shahayadar b'makom hazol b'hakala b'makom hayoker b'hashadchan hayadar b'makom hachasan ein lo mishnei hatzdadim ela k'makom hazol. Now, let's say there are two standards. One lives in New York and one lives in Toronto. In Toronto, the standard is to pay the shadchan 1,000. In New York, the standard is to pay the shadchan 2,000. So, well, the chassan is in one city and the kala is in another city. The kala is from New York, the chassan is in Toronto. The shadchan lives in the city of the chassan in Toronto. So he's only entitled to get paid the lower amount, based where he is. The kevin shuhudar b'makom hazol nisratzalam in agmakomo, because since he's living in the less expensive commission place, it's implicit that he's willing to take the commission of what the other local shadchanim are taking. Aval im haya shadchan dar b'makom hayoker mechuyev l'shalim k'fi makom hayoker. But if he lives in the more expensive place, he lives in New York, you have to pay him what the standard is there. And whatever other customs exist, you go always according to them. That's right. It could also be a differential of whether it's US dollars versus Canadian dollars. Okay. And he says, Ein b'sefer shulchan ha'ezer kama pratim midinei shadchanas. Maybe after Yantif, we'll look up the Sefer Shulchan Ha'ezer if I can find it on my Otsar HaChachma. Okay, next. Mitaveich, an agent or a broker. Mitaveich is a middleman. Okay. Shemasar dira l'Ruveinu l'basof lo kina. He finds an apartment or a house for Ruvain, but Ruvain ends up not purchasing it. So again, this is a broker. So so the broker is not entitled to a commission if the sale never goes through. But then what happens is the exclusive that Ruvain has with the broker expires, and then Ruvain tells his friend Shimon, "Hey Shimon, there's this house. I decided not to buy it, but it's for sale. You may just want to go over to the seller directly and make a deal with the seller. Like in the back of the shul, Nit Shabbos Goret, but but there's this house, and it's Yankel who's selling the house. Go over to Yankel, make a deal with him. I was going to go through the broker, but I decided not to buy it. But now that I know that Yankel is selling it, go buy it directly from Yankel. The Sipar Zel Shimon v'Shimon Kino, and so Shimon goes ahead and buys it without using that broker. So since Shimon is not paying commission, he has no recriminations against Ruvain. Ruvain is not obligated to pay him, and Shimon is not obligated to pay him because Shimon did not retain him as a broker. Now, but if Ruvain now gets a commission from Shimon as a finder's fee, then he has a halachic obligation to give a portion of that to the original broker who found it, or who pointed it to him. But in that situation, it's very interesting if he doesn't say how much you have to give him. And I don't know why. It's a very nondescript. Apparently, they'd have to go to a din Torah, ask a shaila, and find out what the obligation for payment is. Okay. Could be they have to split it 50-50. It's not clear. Okay. It could be, or could be he discovers they're all part of the same shul. And he goes over to Shimon and says, "Oh, Mazel Tov, I just saw you bought a new house. How'd you find out about it?" He says, "Oh, Reuven told me." That's right. The Shabbos Gered, the buying and selling. Okay. Okay, so what would we learning inside Afilo? Let's see. Let's take a look if there's any Biurim over here. Okay. So we were learning this halacha that there could be a loophole out of the Isser of Baltolin when the owner of the business tells his foreman or his manager to hire workers. Neither of them are going to be over on Baltolin, but of course, there's still going to be, if there is a withholding of payment, there still could be a violation of the pasuk in Mishlei. The Sefer Pischei Choshen, Echad Shekasav, the Menahel o Gizbar Havaleka Opatropos, overlay al Bal Tolin. So he says, or Acher Shekasav. He says that if there is a manager of a business who is the administrator and also handles paychecks, then that person will theoretically be over on Bal Tolin, like we said before. That if the administrator of the business has so much consolidated power that he or she not only hires and fires, but they also issue the paychecks, so then they will be over on Bal Tolin. She says, "Kasav the yeshli histapek begizbar haba acharav im chayev betashlum haschira shaharishon socha umemela gam beval Tolin." So he says, but what about a situation where the original administrator did the hiring and then he or she retired and someone else took over, and this employee was hired by the first person, not by the second person? Will the second person be over on Bal Tolin if they withhold payment at any given time? Misvara nira shemikiben shenichnas kigizbar b'makam harishon kibel alav kol achrayis kodma. Would seem, he says, that he really takes over and assumes all of the responsibilities of the first administrator. And Rav Stern just spends the next few lines explaining that it's not so clear. It's not so clear. So just wanted to point that out. There can be a legacy responsibility that carries over from one manager to another, but perhaps not. Okay, next. Shalos charam ayin belikutim bedine shadchanos. So he says, I refer you to all of the cases that I discussed in the halachas of shadchanos. V'ra'isi ba'arach hashulchan even ha'ezer sof simenun shekasav ezelushana. I note that the Aruch HaShulchan writes the following at the end of the laws of in this regard. He says, "V'zehu vadai de'ein l'shum echad mehatzadim lahachnis krovo o ohavo lahashadchanus kishehischilu shadchanim acherim la'asok bazeh dezehu kimat gezel gamur." He says something very interesting. He says, let's say you have a shadchan who's not related to the parties, and that person stands to make money. And then one of the sides decides, oh, my sister knows that family. I'll just have her get involved with the shidduch. He says that's aser al pi halacha, to try and usurp the business from the shadchan who's already started. He says that's a form of theft, as a matter of fact. It's no different from the case of ani hamahapich bichrara, which we've seen a number of times before. That's a phrase in Bava Metzia, which talks about the prohibition of stealing someone's business by unfair competition. So if a person is already prospecting on a deal and they've done all of the legwork and they've already started a relationship with a prospective customer, it's not halachically permitted for someone else to swoop in and try to steal that customer away. And in the same vein, if the shadchan has already started with this process, then it's not only unethical, but it's a form of theft to try and, figure out a way that you can get one of your relatives to handle it instead, so that you won't have to end up paying the shadchan.
Well, how does that compare to the 1/2 closer and open situation?
You have to assume that that's done because it's a cooperative effort. Yeah, the two parties are aware of it. I will tell you that this sometimes does happen in real life. I know my wife told me that it's happened to her, where she's offered to get involved and she's raised the issue, and then the person says, "Oh no, I know someone who knows this girl. I'm going to have them take care of it." Right? So there may be a breach in ethics there. That's right. So
okay?
I'm not sure. I think he says, one second. Let's see, we had seen that question. We had seen that right, we saw it. He says, "V'im echad hatzadim machnes adam acher ligmor hadavar." We saw this yesterday. If one of the sides decides, I'd like to bring in someone else to be the closer, like I'd rather that person do it because I think that person has more of an influence, perhaps, or whatever, whatever reason. Afilu haya bi'achola shel hashadchan harishon l'sayem avodaso lahashvosam. He says, even if the first shadchan, the starter, could or has demonstrated or has offered to do the whole process, they nevertheless cannot lodge a grievance, and they're only entitled to a third, and the other shadchan would get 2/3.
Based on the work ethic.
That's right. That's right. And then he writes, the im heitzia shidduch below yatzamizeh. He says, if someone suggests a name, just puts forward a name, you should look into this. Let me know if I can help. V'lo yatzamizeh, and nothing happened. But then v'achar kach ba acher shenit orer me'atzmo la'oto shidduch v'gamar oso. And then someone else came along independently and said, I think you should look into this. And he was able to get it going, or he or she was able to get it going. Bazeh lo magia l'rishon klum. He says the first person is not entitled to anything in that situation. Because in that situation, you can honestly say that if the second person had not come along, nothing would have happened. It's only when the first person has put in efforts to contact the different parties and they were starting to look into it, and there was a meeting of the minds that perhaps they would agree to meet each other. And then they said, we'd like to get this other person involved because the girl or the boy is getting cold feet, and he's able to salvage it and put it back all together. So then the closer gets the 2/3, the starter gets the 1/3.
What makes sense?
Yeah. I mean, you could argue that in certain situations, the starter should get more than the closer. It all, I mean, every situation is unique, right? But there's a uniform policy just because it's so difficult to, just look at every situation and assign an amount. So it seems like the Chachamim basically said, look, in many situations, this is going to happen. Let's just make a across the board rule. The starter gets 1/3, the closer gets 2/3.
Difficult because there's a continuum of how much work each one did.
That's right. That's right. Sometimes the starter will do many more hours of work than the closer, but the closer may be more influential, may be more of a, have more pull. What you never know.
I guess you come back to it. Suppose it hadn't been there, perhaps it wouldn't have happened, and the opener wouldn't have had any. So in that regard, they should be happy with 1/3 because
Yeah. There could be any number of situations. Okay. So let's go back to this Aruch HaShulchan. He says you can't take away someone else's parnasa just because you feel that you can get one of your relatives to do it for free. Umikol makom yesh ein makpidim bazeh, aval ein lazeh tam nachon ad kan l'shana. There are, however, some people who don't mind. Look, I started the process. You don't want me to be involved anymore. You want your sister-in-law to finish this process. No problem. But that's not a valid reason to not pay the shadchan, just because they happen to be a nice person. Hinema de pshitale the ispe mishum gezel v'lo gara al kol paname ani hamahapich b'churara. He says, so Rav Stern just adds to this, and he gives a rejoinder. He says, it's not so clear to me that this is a form of theft, of unfair competition, of stealing away someone's opportunity. He says, Lanias daiti lo nihira mishum de mashmos haposkim, the iser ani hamahapich b'chrora lokoi ela al ha'acher shaba v'notlo. He says, because when you look at the poskim and they talk about the case of ani hamahapich b'chrora, that case of stealing away someone else's business, is only is only on the person who actually took the business. But aval al hamoicher leka isura. But the seller, in other words, I want to buy someone's house, right? And I've been negotiating with them. We talked about this in the context of home buying in a market, let's say like Thornhill or another very predominantly Jewish neighborhood, where let's say the supply is low and the demand is high. So it could very well be that there's a lot of ethical breaches and halachic breaches if Ruvain has already started negotiating with the seller, and all of a sudden Shimon comes along and says, I know you're negotiating with Ruvain and he's willing to pay you X, I'm willing to pay you X plus Y. So that's a form of gezel, because you're taking away the opportunity from Reuven. You're stealing a prospect that he's already started working on. But what about the seller? Let's call the seller Levi. Levi's this owner of the house, and he's selling the house. Is Levi oiver by consenting to sell the house to Shimon instead of Reuven? So the poskim seem to say that the seller is allowed to sell it to whomever he wishes. The highest bidder. Choshen Mishpat Siman Yud Zayin V'Zel Sham Sham. The Avnei Nezer actually writes this, and he says as follows: La'olam yochel hamocher lachzor meharish v'limkor la'acher, v'ha'acher muter liknos mimenu. He says the seller can always decide, you know what, I don't want to sell it to Reuven. I'd rather sell it to Shimon. The Kevin Shahamocher wrote Limkar Lahaacher below the Lokeach Rishon Shuv Ein Isser Lahaacher. He says once the seller decides that he wants to sell it to Shimon instead of Reuven, there's no breach of halacha or ethics because it's purely his decision. The only prohibition is if Reuven started to negotiate with the seller and everything was going well, and Shimon, while the seller, Levi, is interested in selling it to Reuven, tries to dissuade the seller from selling it to Reuven and instead sell it to him. But if Reuven independently chooses to sell it to Shimon, not because of Shimon's efforts, but rather because the seller decides that he doesn't want to sell it to Reuven. Reuven is negotiating too hard, and he's nickel and diming the seller. He says, I want you to deduct for this, I want you to deduct. And finally he says, listen, I've had enough of this. It's a seller's market, and there's probably a line of people in the community that would want to buy this house. I'm just not interested in dealing with you anymore. You're not a very pleasant person to negotiate with, so I'm walking away from this. In that situation, there's nothing wrong with Shimon buying the house, since at that point the deal has already soured with Reuven, and Shimon can at that point, when he sees that, come in and buy the house. So let's say the people who are involved with the two families who are involved with the shidduch, right? The father of the parents of the boy, the parents of the girl, they see the shadchan is not the right personality for whatever reason. They feel she's too aggressive, she's obnoxious, she's too forthright. They're not very, all of the above. They're not happy with her demeanor, and they decide we'd rather not use her anymore. So they have a right to say, we're not happy. It's like the case of the person that, the seller's in negotiation with the buyer and says, happy with this person. I'd rather get someone else who's a little bit more easy to work with, or maybe the shadchan they're working with has a temper and says, you have to listen to me, and I'm telling you this is how you're supposed to handle it. It could happen like that. There are some people who have very strong, aggressive personalities. Part of the time, that's a key to their success, but it also can be, we all know people like that. They're very in-your-face kind of people, and they can be successful because of that in certain types of salesmanship, but they can also be very difficult to deal with. So based on that, you have the halachic right to say, I've decided I no longer want to deal with you, and we're going to go with another shadchan to work on this. It could be that you might have to pay them a third because they were the opener, the starter. But let's see what he says. He says it's no different from a person who says, I'd rather sell the house to somebody else. I don't want to sell it to you anymore. Tinyana simin lamed vav kasav, dim echad mehatzadim machnas is oba okrova ligmar hadavar, afilo haya bechelo shalashadchan arishon hashvosam gamkin beprotam halalu, vahatzadim ichnisu es oba mokrovam bazein kan ramos klal. He says, and the Noda B'Yehuda writes that in a situation where the parents of the two kids decide that they're going to get their relatives involved instead of the shadchan, there's nothing wrong at all with that. And he says there's no deceitfulness. V'chazeh nasu ma'asim b'chol eis ve'ein lahashadchan harishon al atzadim rak tar umas. He says there's no. He says this happens all the time in real life. The Noda B'Yehuda writes in the 18th century, and he says, and the shadchan may be upset, but he has no halachic right to claim the full fee. Avalo shum dinu mishpat klal, he has no claim at all. The nearer the gam lefima demashmi midvar shalom Noda B'Yehuda the tarumas al kapanim yesh said, vein roy lasos ken lachatchila, and even though the language of the Noda B'Yehuda implies that he has a right to be upset, which implies that there's something unethical being done here. But that seems to me that he only has a right to be upset, and there is a breach of ethics, at least, in a situation where the first shadchan could have followed through successfully and completed the deal. And it's just that the two sides figure, why should we pay a shadchan when we can get it done by our family? But if that's not the case, maybe they fear that the shadchan won't be able to carry through, or the shadchan has become obnoxious and a nuisance, or things like that. So then he feels that there's nothing wrong if they want to someone else or a family member to complete the process for them. Now, again, I don't think that we're not going to have time to finish it, but he does talk about that first third at the end, so maybe we'll finish that up later on. So have a good Shabbos and a good Yantif. I guess we'll resume this on Tuesday morning. Okay? So have a